Hi, everybody. I'm Joe Lample, the Joe behind Joe Gardner, and welcome to the Joe Gardner Show podcast YouTube version. Today, I am excited to welcome someone whose work sits right at the heart of what we talk about on the show all the time, the relationship between people, plants, and the natural world. You know that feeling after walking out into the garden and spending even a small amount of time there? Our stress levels go down, our creativity goes up, and we're reminded of that awe-inspiring feeling that we get all around us, consciously or subconsciously. And that's exactly what our guest today, Dr. Kathy Willis, does with her new book, Good Nature. It digs into the science behind something gardeners have always felt instinctively. Overall, Good Nature is a book about how nature influences human health and well-being, where plants are the stars of the show. Suffice it to say that Professor Willis brings the science behind that to life, and it opens up a whole new way of thinking about the garden and natural spaces that we interact with every day. And because we love Geek Alert so much, you'll be happy to know that this episode certainly qualifies for that. Now, a little bit about Dr. Kathy Willis. She's one of the leading plant scientists in biodiversity and experts of our time. She's a professor of biodiversity at the University of Oxford and the former director of science at the Royal Botanic Garden, Kew. And she helped advance global research on plant conservation and ecosystem resilience. Definitely one of our kind of people. So let's get started with my conversation with Kathy Willis. I hope you enjoyed this Geek Alert worthy episode, and I'll see you on the other side for a wrap up and some new announcements that you'll want to hear about. Professor Kathy Willis, thank you for being here. I really enjoy reading good books, especially when they're sciencey related to gardening and nature. And ironically, in my podcast theme, we always talk about the connection between people and the natural world, and plants, of course, is the centerpiece.
Yeah.
And your book seems to really encompass all of that together. So I'm very excited to have this conversation. So I really do appreciate you being here. Thanks for taking the time to do that.
I'm really looking forward to this. It's going to be great.
Good. Well, thank you. All right. So first of all, I always love to ask your journey to, you've got some really prestigious work and job titles and things that you do now and have done for years. How did that evolve to that? Or was it serendipity? Give us kind of the overview of you, wherever you want to begin.
Yeah, I stopped when as a child. I always just liked being outdoors, always, even though we grew up in London. But we grew up in a sort of northern part of London, which is quite leafy. And my mother was of the generation that was evacuated during the Second World War from central London into the countryside, into the Leicestershire countryside, which is still really beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And so she knew all the plant names, and she knew all these sort of things about landscapes. And I think that just rubbed off onto me. And whenever we went on holiday, she'd always be pointing out the flowers in the hedgerows. And so I got very, attached to the environment. And when I was at school, I just, the subjects I most liked were things like biology, but it was more the sort of whole organism plants and those sorts of things. And I also liked geography, and I liked chemistry, and the interaction of the natural world. And so I went to do an environmental science degree originally. And I was first generation in our family to ever go to university. My sister had gone, she'd cut the way through. And I got to university, but I chose environmental science. And at that point, that was at the point where people really weren't thinking about climate change. This is 1982.
Mm.
And my father was very bemused because he hadn't been to university, had left school at the age of 12. So he sort of thought, what on earth is this environmental rubbish? It's sort of voodoo science. But anyway, I persisted. And when I got to university, that's University of Southampton. And when I got there, I realized that I loved that course. I spent a lot of time in the New Forest, which is absolutely beautiful. A lot of the coursework was outdoors. And from there, I went on to do a PhD in Cambridge in botany. But again, looking at vegetation and how vegetation responds to climate and other environmental drivers. I stayed there for 13 years in the end. And then I had 1 year as a plant sciences editor at Cambridge University Press. And I was terrible at that, terrible. It's like, this is not the job for me. It's my fault. I mean, I'm not very good being indoors with books. I don't know why I thought I should even apply for it, actually. So after spending this time at the publisher for 1 year, I then went back into research But it was a very good year out because it made me decide what I did want to do rather than just carrying on. And then I got to a particular point in my career where I was still in Cambridge, and I suddenly realized that I was on soft money, research money. And I saw a permanent job being advertised in Oxford in geography. And I thought, oh, I can teach geography. It's environmental. And I got to Oxford and found a lot of it was not environmental science. So the learning curve was very steep. Let's put it that way.
Mhm.
But I learned huge amounts about subjects I'd never really embraced before, about human nature, interactions, about landscapes. It was very interesting, and also I had to teach tutorials on first year climatology.
Ooh.
And as a result of that, I used to go sit at the back of the lecture, so I was always one stage ahead of the lecturer when I then did my small group teach for the students. I'm sure anyone who's taught students is like this. Anyway, cut a long story short, I sort of carried on in geography until I got to a point where I was running a big master's program on biodiversity conservation.
Ooh.
And they advertised a job in zoology in Oxford for a chair, a professor in biodiversity conservation. I thought, oh, well, I can do that. And I applied and got it. Of course, I did exactly the same as I'd done before. I jumped from a department that I was quite comfortable in, an area that I've never worked on animals, never will. But zoology in Oxford is really much more about whole organism, and now it's become a department of biology. And from there, I was asked if I would go and be the first director of science at Kew Gardens in London to set up this whole new structure that they were having. And I decided I did that on sabbatical from Oxford for 5 years. It was a tough job. There's 400 scientists there. I was responsible for all of these major collections like the herbarium, the fungarium, the Millennium Seed Bank, the molecular records, and the scientists that work on them. And they have, so many international partnerships. And then after 5 years, Oxford said, "Are you coming back?" And Kew said, "Are you staying?" And so I went back to Oxford. And I've been running a college, one of the undergraduate colleges, and resumed my research in Oxford. And then my most recent thing I've done about 3 years ago, we have 2 legislative houses in our parliament. We have a lower house, which is basically elected house, and we have a second house called the House of Lords, which scrutinises and amends legislation to make it better, effectively, or try and make it better. And so I've gone into the House of Lords as I'm what is known as a crossbench peer, which means I'm non-political. And I work on legislation. I'm very much on nature, climate, health, education. So I do that alongside the other 2 jobs. So I have this I'm always juggling these 3 hats. They're all great and really interesting. Sometimes they all crash into each other. And then everyone does many jobs now. So, I mean, I'm not alone in that. But that's where I've got to. And the book that we're talking about is very much, it sort of pulled together many different strands of my life into writing a book. And it was partly driven by a frustration that I kept coming across, particularly in policy, where the minute you talk about nature, people always put it into sort of a fluffy, bunny, pretty flower bucket. And they never see it as being a scientific relationship between health and nature, what's going on in our bodies when we interact with nature. So that's why I sort of wrote the book from both a policy perspective, but also using my scientific knowledge as well.
And when did you decide to write the book? And was there anything that was the catalyst to finally get you to do it? Clearly, you had been, mulling these thoughts over for a while as you went about your business. But at some point you said, I need to write this book. And then you did it. Anything you can pin to that led you to start it?
Well, I was working, before I went into the House of Lords, I did quite a lot of working on big international projects. And there's one I was working on, which is called the International Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Long name, many, many countries involved. And my role in that, we were doing a global assessment on nature. And it's how it underpins so many functions that we all rely on. And my role, or one of my roles, was to find out the relationship between nature and human health. And I imagined it would be sort of stuff like, shade from trees in streets, make the streets cooler. This urban heat island that affects the stuff. And in fact, the paper I kept coming across was this paper that's published in the American journal Science in 1984, which showed that people who looked out of hospital window beds, those that looked onto trees, All these people had gallbladder operations. And in those days, you stayed in hospital for like 10 days.
Okay.
And the people that looked onto the brick wall, or the people who looked onto trees and not brick walls, they had less pain relief, and they had less pain relief. They recovered faster, they were happier, and they went home 2 to 3 days quicker. And I thought, this is really odd. A, that it's published in Science. B, that they've obviously got enough scientific data to show this, but also the whole concept that just looking at something to trigger these different pathways in the body that result in these responses. And it made me sort of think, well, what else is there out there that shows, what are the mechanisms of action that are going on in our bodies when we interact with nature?
Right.
And so that's where I really started this journey of looking. And the more I looked, the more I found so much evidence out there, but not published in the sort of journals that most people are looking at, or not biologists. These are in the top medical journals like the Lancet, the top psychiatry journals, and all over the place. But actually a big body of literature that's been emerging in the last 15 to 20 years.
That is fascinating. And I am familiar with that study. I've come across it several times in my work as well.
Yeah.
And I really loved seeing that you mentioned that in your book, and that's kind of what started it. And thank you for sharing that. I'm curious though, in your research and in putting this book together, did you recognize anything about yourself that had changed, or maybe an observation that related to how these patients were healing faster from just looking at something pretty rather than a wall? Did you see anything in yourself that made you think, yeah, I get that because I remember this about me, or I recognize this?
So one of the things that when I started doing this, and I was still working at Kew at that point, was I had already realized that if I went walking in the gardens at lunchtime for half an hour, I was always it was a tough job, and I was always in a much better mood in the afternoon. And if I'd walked the same amount of time, but I'd walk to the local shops, you're walking down the street, you've got cars, you've got traffic, everything else. But I'd never given it any thought at all, really. But every time within the book, every time I've read and researched a section, because I split it up into, the different senses, our sight, sound, our touch, our taste, all these main senses. Every time I've researched and came across these studies, stuff started to build up in my house. So I'm sitting in my study now, I'm surrounded by plants. I have diffusers down the other end of the room. I look out the window onto green. My computer screen saver is now of trees.
Oh,
All of these things we don't need to wait. There's the whole thing about forest bathing, and you can go and lie in the forest for 2 hours. But how many of us have got time to go and lie in the forest? Very few. But there are so many small tweaks you can make within your own lifestyle, your own daily interactions, that can absolutely trigger these physiological and psychological changes in our bodies that really do bring about health benefits. So I have, and it's, whenever I talk about people, oh, that's obvious. Yeah, I knew that. But then suddenly they think, oh, I didn't know that. And I didn't know that. So there are also some other things that people none of us, I certainly knew some of this stuff.
This is fascinating and the perfect segue, because I did want to talk to you about some of your observations related to the senses, such as sight, smell, and then we can go a little bit geekier with the environmental biome, because that's always, something that doesn't get talked about enough. But
No.
if you're open to that, I'd love to talk to you about the section under senses, and maybe start with sight. Tell me some of the things there.
The really interesting thing with sight was three interesting aspects, because it's both the shape and the color and the fractal dimension. So shape and color, you might guess. Fractal dimension sounds like a nightmare, but I'll unpack it.
Good.
So with just even looking out the window, they have or even on a computer screen with trees or no trees. Lovely experiment where they have participants just sat there, they were wired up, so they're measuring their heart rate and heart rate variability, just very simple measurements of stress. And also they did psychological well-being questionnaires at the end of the experiment, at the beginning and end. And just 90 seconds of looking at trees on your computer screen compared to looking at an urban scape like the New York skyline, 90 seconds, you get a significant lowering of your blood pressure, but also if you look at, if they wire up the sort of one of the skull caps where they're finding out where the blood flow is in the brain, they find that the blood is actually going to those parts of the brain that are more associated with physiological calming. So you are calmer by looking at an image of trees on your computer screen than you are of an urban environment. And the same as when you look out the window. If you look out the window onto trees rather than onto bricks, then you have a very, very good reaction. And really interestingly, if you're really stressed, it's a good idea to look out the window onto something green, because they've shown that when they automatically stress people, I wouldn't do this experiment, but you can stress people with an electric shock to their finger. Doesn't sound good to me, but you
Oh.
can. And when they did this, and then they measured their heart rate, how they calmed down, those that glanced out the window or able to look onto green recovered much faster than those who didn't. So that's a really interesting aspect of it. But then the next set of things, people looked at color,
Okay.
and they used them ivy leaves, which are beautiful. The heterohelix, it's slightly different to the American ivy.
It looks very similar.
It looks similar. Anyway, that's, as you better than anyone, that you get these it hybridizes really easily. So you get reds, greens, orange, gold. So they use these different color leaves, and then they got people to look at these different color leaves. They're all the same shape, same size, and wired up their brains again and measured blood pressure and the like. And again, it was the green and yellows and the green and white leaves that induced the greatest amount of physiological and psychological calming when you look at them. And so you think about what plants you have in your desk. It's a really interesting, because even a single white rose with green leaves on your desk versus none, the experiments shown that people's blood pressure goes down. So I can see no plants in your background, I have to say.
Wait now. That's because it's blurry. I have.
Oh, I can see there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I've
have-
got about 4 here, and they're all. I mean, the
and a rescue aloe right here. I'm working on it.
Yeah, I've got a fairly dead spider plant just above me here, sort of hanging down. But so that's really interesting. Whereas red leaves in particular seem to, it's certainly in the psychological assessments, can cause quite a lot of rise in irritation in people. They get more, So now that's slightly cultural. That one, there is a cultural bias in that color. But the thing that's got really interesting, this is the third thing, is the fractal dimension. So the fractal dimension is when something divides into itself more and more and more. So if you think, if you can get a computer generated picture that keeps going in and in and in and in and in.
Okay.
But actually nature is a lot of nature is very fractal. So if you think about a shoreline and then on a coast, and then what you have is you have the inlet, and then you have smaller inlets and smaller inlets. And so that's a fractal pattern.
Okay.
And trees are another one. If you think of a branch, then you get a smaller branch, then you get a smaller branch, you get a twig. So that same pattern is being repeated through and through. And what they showed is that actually when people look at different fractal dimensions, that you get different responses. And when we look across a horizon, what happens is our eyes are picking out the fractal dimension of the horizon. So when you scan a horizon, so if you think about a horizon, you think about a conifer horizon. So you've got lots of pointy pine trees on it. So it's going up and down and up and down and up and down. So that's quite a regular fractal pattern.
Yep.
You think about a more open savanna landscape, a few trees interacted on an open landscape. That's not as fractally sort of regular.
Right.
So that's a more open landscape, and that's got a fractal dimension mid-level, about 1.3. And then you think about someone like New York's skyline. That actually doesn't have any fractal dimension, or very little, because it's all square and different shapes and different lines. So when they wired people up and got them to look at these different fractal dimensions, they found the greatest physiological relaxation in terms of measuring from brainwave activity and other metrics was when people looked at that mid-level, the more open landscape, the savanna trees on a scattered landscape. Now, the interesting thing is, when you think about it, how many pictures do you see on walls where it's a more open landscape with a few trees? And you think about the earliest gardeners like Capability Brown. What did they create? They created an open landscape with a few scattered trees on it. And so I think inherently we probably know that is the landscape we most enjoy seeing, but it also seems to trigger the greatest physiological reaction to it and makes people more relaxed when they're looking at it compared to these other landscapes. So this
Is
shape is, I find the shape thing really fascinating because once you start to think about it, you think, gosh, that's a really interesting dimension that probably makes sense.
I think about when we design landscapes, we plant in odd numbers because to our eye, that just seems to work better than even numbers of
Yeah.
clusters of the same plant. Intuitively, but that's our body tells us that we like that better visually. Back to sight, for example, and the colors, I found that very interesting because to me, just personally, yellow doesn't seem that calming to me. And yet I still love a nice area of daffodils and, a
Yeah.
lot of that. But there's this, I've read, you mentioned the autumn paradox,
Oh,
maybe?
yeah.
Yeah.
So that it's funny, we're quite fickle about color. So but just going back to your yellow comment
Hmm.
before, I think the most important thing, or the most clear point that came across me from looking at all of these studies, is what's happening is when we see these things, we see these colors, we see this is automatically happening in our bodies. So it's not linked to preference. It's an automatic process that's happening, like our autonomic nervous system, our hormonal system, our endocrine system, all of these, it triggers these pathways. You don't have to go into nature and think, I'm in nature, I must now be calm, or I like the color of that flower. It seems the yellow and white flowers are the ones that automatically trigger these changes that occur. But it's quite interesting. So in terms of preference, they haven't actually measured whether or not this actually comes through to all these automatic processes. In terms of preference, if you the studies have shown that people, they much prefer the green until you get to autumn. And then all of a sudden, preference levels for reds and oranges
Yeah.
shoots up. But then when you get back to the end after autumn, after the leaf fall, it goes back to being green again. So we're quite fickle with color, I think. So color is a tricky one. I know,
Yeah.
and I was saying there are some cultural differences that have been detected as well with color. And so it's one of those ones where you sort of there needs to be many of these things. There needs to be more research on it, particularly if you're using color and colored plants in particular environments to induce calmness. Then we really do need to understand what colors we're using
Yeah.
in these spaces.
What about our sense of smell? How does that play out?
Oh, well,
Ha.
smell the one that really surprised me
Mm,
because I'd always rather assume that it was just a nice scent. I didn't really
mm.
think much more into how that's lavender smells nice. Your grandmother told you it made you sleep well, and we have all these stuff to spray around. Until I realized that first of all, when you breathe a smell in, it so those molecules, what's making that smell is effectively it's called a volatile organic compound. It's a carbon compound that when it hits air, it turns into a gas, evaporates, and that's the smell you get. And when you breathe it in, it passes across the membrane in both your nose, but also in your lungs, into your bloodstream. So how do they know that? They've measured people's bloods before they walk in a pine forest. They've measured the ambient air in a pine forest and found it's high in pinene. That's the compound that creates that piney smell. And then they measured the people once before they walked, they measured it in their bloods, very low levels. They walk for 20 minutes, measure their bloods again, great spike of pinene in their blood.
Oh.
Now,
Oh.
why is that relevant? Because what they find is many of these compounds, or there's a number of them, where those compounds interact, once they're in your bloods, they interact with the same biochemical pathways as if taking prescription drugs.
Wow.
So lavender
Mm,
does make you sleepier, and it makes you sleep deeper sleep and for longer intervals of sleep. And they've shown that through clinical experiments as well.
mm.
Rosemary makes you more awake. It affects that a particular biochemical pathway. It makes you more alert. So does peppermint. So think about chewing gum,
Yeah.
and sucking mints. People suck mints to keep awake. Yeah, and it will work because it's doing that. And then there's some really curious ones, and one of the most interesting ones, I think, and is now being picked up in oncology journals, is the heavier smell that's attached to cedar and things like the Japanese cypress, it's called hinoki oil, if you're taking the
Yeah.
pure oil from it. And they show, first of all, in clinical studies, when people inhale this for 3 nights when they're sleeping in a room with it, they found their adrenaline hormone went right down, but they also found a really elevated level of natural killer cells in their bloods. Now, these are the cells that attack cancers and virus cells. So we all want elevated levels.
Did you say killer cells?
Yeah.
Okay, just want to clarify that.
They're called natural killer cells.
Yeah.
Then, and I always thought it was a really interesting experiment, but even more interesting, they've a follow-up that's been published a couple of years ago and published in this journal on Target. They had one group of people. They first of all looked at people who lived right near to a cedar forest or lived in it right around the edge versus the same number that lived further away. And they looked at their natural killer cells in their bloods. And sure enough, those that lived in the forest had much higher levels, statistically significant higher levels than those that lived further away. But also they sent another group of people walking in this forest for 5 days. And after 5 days, they had these really high levels of natural killer cells in their bloods. But even more importantly, 5 days later, they still had the elevated levels. So it's not like it just elevates and then it goes back down again. And so therefore, that's sort of building up a sort of an immune, sort of a resilience within your body by actually just inhaling these smells. And then the other one, limonene, the one you get from citrusy fruits, is being shown to reduce inflammation in the, in the esophagus and in this whole sort of respiratory part of the body.
Yeah.
And there's clinical trials on that. That's early days, but there's so much that we ignore about plants and smell. And I'd always just, as I say, I now have a whole research project on smell and volatiles, because you suddenly realize, well, if it's really pouring with rain and horrible outside, can you get the same benefits from going and standing in a glass house in the Botanic Gardens, for example? Had students we've measured them after they spent 20 minutes sitting in different glass houses compared to a control room. And there's a statistically significant difference in physiological and psychological calming when they sit in a glass house, which is full of smells of citrus fruit or whatever, versus if they sit in just a normal classroom.
One more reason to love a glass house, like you needed one.
I love glass houses.
Yeah, I mean,
any day.
any day, with or without those scents. But yeah,
Exactly.
Another case. Have they been able to replicate or extract the enzymes or whatever it is, the VOCs in the hinoki cypress, to be able to take advantage of that without having the plant in your house or your garden, your glass house?
So a lot of these experiments are, then that's what I do. I mean, you can buy little bottles of hinoki oil, which you can just drop into a straightforward diffuser, and you can use it yourself. I mean, about every 10 days or so, I'll just switch this thing on, have a sort of study, have a quick puff of it. It won't do any harm, but it certainly will almost certainly do some good.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Do you want to move on from that to environmental microbiome?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before.
I'm happy to talk about that. I mean, this one is extraordinary, really. Again, so I didn't know much about the smell, and so smell was one of those sort of moments you think, this is just extraordinary, and then I got onto the environmental microbiome, and every time I talked about this, somebody had said to me, every time I talked about sort of health, and I had a number of people saying, what about in the soil? What about the microbes in the soil? And I just thought, oh, yeah. Then I started to look around, and there was a paper that was published, I don't know, about 15, 16 years ago, by an absolutely top-notch ecologist who's now sadly passed, but in Finland, in Helsinki. And he had worked with these two top medics, and they wrote a paper called the biodiversity hypothesis, which said that since we have lost more and more nature from our environments, from our cities, we've had a massive increase in all of these autoimmune diseases and inflammatory diseases that are not, they are the non-communicable diseases like asthmas and strokes and all the other stuff. And they said it's because we've lost our environmental microbiome. And I thought, oh, what else are going on about? And they hypothesized that when you spend time in nature, that your body adopts the good bacteria that is all around us in nature. Now, that was a hypothesis, but over the last 15 to 20 years, more and more people have shown this. So what I hadn't realized is terms of our own gut microbiome, only 7% of it is inherited. 93% of it is due to our environment, which is why people are drinking probiotics and doing all these other things to try and change their gut, because we now know that the gut is actually, and the microbiome in our gut is such an important part of our whole health structure. And some people call it, the fourth organism or whatever. And what they've shown now is that certain environments, even outside in your front garden, if you've got plants in your front garden, you will have this wonderful good bacteria being exuded from the plants. And plants and soil in particular will then, if you spend time in that, your body adopts the signature of that microbiome. And the most interesting experiment to prove this was a sort of a double-blind, perfect clinical study that was carried out on nursery school, kindergarten age children in Finland, where they basically gave one set of children played in a sandpit, which they put a whole lot of soil in it from the local forest. And then the other sandpit was sterile. And they did a number of experiments like this with mat and everything else. And they measured their gut bacteria, their gut microbiome, and their skin microbiome, but they also measure their bloods, because of course there's lots of studies showing when your gut bacteria gets better, your bloods improve and your inflammatory markers go down. And sure enough, after 28 days, the children that played in the sandpit with soil had a completely elevated gut flora, really diverse, full of really good things, all only because they'd played in this sandpit with this soil, which had given them the dirt had given them but also that when they measured their bloods, the T cells, which are really good indicators of inflammatory change, showed a significant reduction. So that you can see that actually these things are linked together. So then they tested it on other people where even just having a green wall in an office, and they looked at these office workers who have one of those living green walls behind them in the office, and they looked at their bloods and their gut flora and their skin, the bacteria in their gut and the skin. And sure enough, again, after 28 days, those that had the living green wall in the office had this greatly improved gut and skin bacterial, full of the good stuff, the stuff that you drink a probiotic drink to have. But again, they showed a really important change in their T cells in their bloods, indicating reduction in their levels of inflammation. So to me, and then people have measured, they've measured the bacteria loads or the microbiome across a park, like an urban park in Adelaide. And if you go from like a soccer pitch where fairly low levels, as you'd imagine, but as you move towards the edge, where you've got more and more trees and more biodiversity, you get this significant increase in the levels, in the diversity of the microbiome. And therefore, those are the sort of environments you want to spend time in. And soils, especially organic soils where you're gardening and doing, growing your own crops, absolutely jam-packed full of bacteria. So we should be gardening without our gloves on. We should not be putting chemicals on the soils that are going to kill all these wonderful bacteria. And we can get so much. And this is why so many gardeners are healthy. And I'm sure of it now. It's sort of like they're there, they're touching, they're smelling, they're absolutely surrounded by this wonderful, healthy environment that really, really does make a difference to our health. It's not just voodoo science. And that's the most important thing. That these are affecting the same pathways that we're often being told prescription drugs are the only answer. They're not. Interacting with nature can in many cases bring about the same outcomes as taking a prescription drug, but it's free and it's good for you. And so therefore the whole link to garden is just, we should all be there.
I have a huge, as you can see, I have a huge smile on my face, and I know probably 99.9% of everyone listening right now is feeling the same way, because we're an audience of gardeners for the most part.
Yeah.
And that was a beautiful segue, because I was curious to know, of all these really simple activities that we should be doing anyway. And many of us love that and spend a lot of time doing some of those things, like being
Yeah.
outside and, playing in the garden. What is there prescription? That's the word you said a minute ago, kind of like medicine. What would be the guidelines for, how much is enough? And is it possible to have too much, or do we lose the value of more time versus a certain amount of time, et cetera?
So there's some lovely studies where they've looked at people, like how long do you need to be in outdoors to
Yeah.
get the benefits? And there's a lovely study done by the University of Michigan where they gave members of staff a choice. You could walk for any length of time you liked, need to be during daylight, and people would or walk, sit, run, whatever in the park. And they measured the salivary amylase before and after the time they spent in nature, and cortisol in this again from swabs, salivary swabs. And the really interesting thing is what they found is that 20 to 30 minutes was when you got the maximum reduction in cortisol and salivary amylase. So that's when you get the maximum stress reduction through those enzyme and hormonal responses. 30 minutes, you didn't get much more difference.
Huh.
Less than 20. So there's a sweet spot
Yeah,
between
sweet spot.
30 minutes. And beyond that, you're not going to get much more. But what I really liked about that study was that the greatest benefits were found with people who are sitting and walking rather than running. Now, because I'm not a great runner. Now, I'm sure when you run, you get all other sorts of benefits, but the
Yeah.
idea that those benefits of nature are very much coming through from, the sort of the more sort of sedentary approach to being outdoors. But it has changed me because sometimes when I'm walking my dogs and I just think, 10 minutes around the park, that's enough.
Yeah.
And now I don't. Now I think, no, I'm going to do 20 minutes around the park.
Right.
Small change. And then also, so, again, there's some lovely studies where they've shown that, going back to what I was saying at the beginning of Q, that, if you've only got 20 minutes lunchtime, walk around the edge of the park, walk near some trees. Don't go to somewhere that doesn't have that nature, because it makes such a big difference. And it's a small change that can make a very big difference. Change your route to work. They're really small changes, but can make a very, very big difference to your overall health.
I'm sure that is also music to people's ears that are challenged for time, as most of us are, and you already acknowledged that. And for the ones that are non-runners who can get the benefits by just sitting and enjoying the scenery from a bench or sitting, even better, right? That's all good news.
Yeah, very good news.
You did a study, or you referenced a study about depression and anxiety, and exposure to nature, if I get this right, really got people back to work faster than not having that exposure.
Yeah, it's a really interesting study. It's carried out at the University of Copenhagen, and they wanted to actually understand the efficacy. Which one is better? Is nature, interacting with nature, is that the same or worse than doing something like cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a well-prescribed therapy for depression? So they took a group of clinically ill people with mental health issues who'd been off work because of them for a year, and they split them in two. And one half did 2 times a week. They did cognitive behavioral therapy with a trained therapist. And the other half went into the university's gardens and joined in with gardening activities for 2 times a week. And after the 10 weeks, they looked at how many people were back at work, but also how many visits they had to their practitioner, to their doctor.
Yeah.
And they found similar results, that 80% were back at work. So it seemed that even though the gardening was really much, much cheaper, that you got the same result. But the really interesting thing from that study, a year later, they went back to look at who was still at work. Now, I had assumed those who'd got the cognitive behavioral therapy had learnt mechanisms to cope with things, but it was the other way around. It was those that gardened and done the gardening. There was something like 70% of those were back at work, compared to 60 who'd done the cognitive behavioral therapy. So there's a really interesting cost benefit and a long-term efficacy result in there. And the real problem I think right now is that I can count on one hand the number of studies that have done that sort of comparative work that's really needed.
Yes.
If we're going to persuade the health professionals to actually take this seriously, we have to treat nature and there's experimentation we do on nature and its impact on health in the same way, in the same framing. But right now we tend to, because it's nature, people seem to, immediately you talk about nature, it has to be into the, I've said it before, but it goes into this very sort of very touchy-feely bucket. And therefore you lose sight of the quantitative evidence base that's needed to persuade clinicians, but also those funding. I think in the UK, or any healthcare practitioner who's having to find the money to pay for these things,
Yeah, it's always
it,
that.
you need to be able to demonstrate this is a cheaper and as effective way of getting these outcomes.
Mental health doesn't get, I don't believe it gets enough attention. And I think when you try to put nature into that equation, they just, it's like woo woo. It's like they don't
Yeah.
take nature, the nature part seriously enough to
So,
give it its due.
yeah. Oh, yeah. But also, I mean, the other really interesting thing that I find, there's a lot of these population level studies now done where they look at how close people are to living to nature, how close their home is to nature, and they compare it to their mental health records.
Mm.
And there's a study carried out in Wales 2 years ago, published in a big top medical journal, and they looked at a huge number of people, millions of people, and they showed very clearly over a 10-year period, it was 3 million people over a 10-year period, and they showed that for every 350 meters from green space, away from green space they lived, the higher the incidence of common mental disease. And it didn't matter what your socioeconomic background was. In fact, if you were poorer, you got more benefits, health benefits and mental health benefits, than if you were richer from living close to green space.
Is that,
Now,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you may be going to answer this question, but it makes me want to think, is that because they're more reliant or less able to use other sources such as pharmaceuticals or things like that? What was the relationship to that?
possibly, I don't know. They haven't really
Yeah.
looked at
Okay.
that, other than to show that there's this a really, really big difference. And this is over a 10-year period. Now, if there were any other public health data that was not linked to nature, was linked to something else, you would immediately have every healthcare professional looking all over this. But this study is sitting there, and there are many, many of them. There are some in the States showing the same. If the closer you live to green space, the better your mental health outcomes on a longer term, the less prescriptions you need to have for mental health and less mental health problems you have. And so the links are there, but of course that is just a correlation. That's not showing you what's going on. That's why it's so important to have this data underneath to say, what are the mechanisms then happening in physiologically, psychologically, that are bringing about these changes.
Speaking of correlations, you just reminded me of something else I read, and that was the allotment advantage. There's a benefit, of course, to being outside and being in a garden, but there was a study that you referenced that showed that people that had allotments tended to be healthier
Yeah.
than maybe somebody gardening solo.
Yeah.
Talk about that one.
Well, it's an interest. They compared things like heart attacks, strokes, mental health, the whole lot. And it was a big metadata, big meta-analysis of many, many studies. And they looked at gardening, front gardens, back gardens, and allotments.
Mm.
And they showed that those people who gardened had allotments and gardened for allotments were the healthiest. And they concluded it was partly the diversity of different plants in the garden. That when they looked at, where are the correlations in here? They did mention in there that again, coming back to the soil, the environmental microbiome, all the sounds and everything else. But also, I think we do have to recognize that some people find a backyard stressful, especially if they're by themselves. So therefore, this is not always going to be brilliant to have your own green space. It's better to go and walk in someone else's. And I can relate to that.
Me too.
I mean, I've got to the point now where I don't worry about it as much, but it's sort of, there's something in us that thinks, oh, we must make that tidy. It must do that. Or something becomes a chore. It ceases to be relaxing. So, and also the other thing is the front garden is more important than the back garden.
Mm-hmm.
And they showed, even with people who are really quite mentally ill and quite poor, that a few pot plants in the front garden can make a very big difference to them. And again, it's because you go in and out your front door every day, whereas you don't always go into your backyard. So it's an interesting, so it's having these pot plants, even just a few pots there. Unfortunately, what many of us do now is we pave over our front gardens or our front yards and put our car on it.
Mm.
So, but there's still space, even if you've done that, there's still space for a few pots. Yeah.
Okay, a couple questions back to you and your relation to your years of experience in applying this information that you've learned in writing the book and your research. Do you have like a single best prescription? We've talked about, all of these benefits. If you were giving advice to somebody that said, is there one thing I can do or focus on of the things that we've talked about today that would really give me the best advantage using nature as my pharmacy?
Yeah. I mean, well, I'm a great supporter of the noble spider plant. So
Oh.
the spider plant, first of all, it's got green and white leaves.
It's-
Secondly, they did this lovely experiment where they shut this poor spider plant in a room, in a sterile room, and then they went back and measured the microbiome in the room. And this single plant had seeded the air, it seeded the air, the ceiling, the walls, everything within 8 weeks. All
oh,
it's full of good. So it give you that good microbiome. They're hard to kill. You
yeah.
have to constantly sort of touch the plant because you're trying to stop the thing, it sprouts all over the place. So your hands are getting. So a single little spider plant on your desk can make a huge difference. And that would be my one piece of advice.
Well, when I discovered my love of gardening at 8 years old, I was planting anything and everything I could get my hands on. I grew up in Miami where it was very tropical and we had a patio, screened-in patio, and I had my share and then some of spider plants. And of course, you can easily propagate them. So
Oh, yeah,
every
they're
week I was
wonderful.
making more. Yeah.
No,
They,
and there's something very satisfying about spider plants. I've just got a couple around me right now. And they went out of fashion. They're a bit like sort of 1970s hangover. Some people see them as
yep.
like, but actually, now when you look at them, you think, oh, these are fantastic plants. I've got one in my bedroom that I've had for 45 years now.
Really.
Keeps going. So
Isn't that
yeah.
interesting? And speaking of retro plants, the Sansevieria, the one that you can't see in the background over here, it's such a bulletproof plant. You can't kill that either. And in fact, when I first bought that one, I forgot I bought it when I stuck it back there because it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. And the first time I realized I had it was 8 months after I bought it, and I obviously hadn't watered it, but it's under those LED lights, and it was as if I had pampered it. It was perfectly healthy, slightly wrinkly, but a little bit of water, and it was back to
And
normal.
often want to go, yeah, no, it's so satisfying.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so two more questions. I'm going to let you go. Back to this experience of writing your book, and you actually kind of shared about your walking your dogs and going from 10 to 20 minutes. Can you peg any other activity changes for you that have been a direct result of your research and writing this book that you do?
Yeah, I think, well, I certainly, as well as having houseplants, I now diffuse different scents in different
Right.
rooms. I have lavender in my bedroom. I have cedar in the hall when people, they're, so I do that now sort of fairly routinely. I'd never did that before.
Hmm.
And I think I'm much more, I think you can do an awful lot indoors. You don't have to go outside to do these things. As like I was saying, changing my computer screen.
Right.
We can help ourselves. It's preventative. We don't have to wait to get sick. We can start doing this now. We don't have to wait for it to be prescribed even. You can do it yourself. And that's what I think is the really important thing. And it doesn't matter if the plant dies, you have to buy another one. This is not the Chelsea Flower Show. This is about working with plants, enjoying plants because of the incredible health benefits they provide us with.
Oh my gosh, I could just end right there. That's a beautiful finish. And I talk about that. That's a good example related to gardening or with anything, but always
Yeah,
with gardening. I talk about the benefits of being proactive rather than reactive. And
absolutely. It's the same, and like you're saying when you're a child, I mean, my gardening is chaotic, I'd say. I go and if it dies, I put something else in the ground.
right.
And because I just enjoy now in the garden, in my own garden as well. The other thing I realized that it's the different shades of green that are really important. So I've
Mhm.
stopped worrying so much about having some fantastic herbaceous border. I've got, outside of that's my window, but I've got a whole sort of fernery section now, and then I've got sort of different shapes down the other end, and I've got just all sorts of different shapes and sounds and
Yeah.
things that bring in the bird song, so you can pick up this beautiful, tuneful bird song. There are so many things you can do without having to be a brilliant gardener, but just enjoy it.
And that realization alone, if there was one mental change that you could make, is just cutting yourself some slack and having more fun and not
Yeah.
being so hard on yourself. That alone can reduce tremendous amount of
Oh,
stress,
absolutely. We're all very good at beating ourselves up
aren't
all
we?
the time. And
Yes.
I mean, well, you just go into a spiral. And so I think sometimes you have to step back. And I think when you're stepping back, that's the time is to go and breathe the air outside.
Yeah.
And it just that action alone, or just do a bit of digging or a bit of mudding around. As I say, I never wear garden gloves anymore because I know that touching the soil is just such an important part of it.
The very last thing, and you already mentioned an important point, and that is you don't have to walk outside to benefit from many of the things that we've talked about. But it's always good to get outside and get a breath of fresh air. But if you were to mention one thing that we could all do when going outside to strengthen our connection to the natural world, would it be as simple as just getting outside for 20 minutes, or would you
I
add to
think,
that?
yeah, I think the thing that we can all do is once you get outside is make sure you're somewhere that's green. But I often now go and touch the plants, touch the leaves. I think that links you back to them, and you suddenly start to feel these different shapes and textures, and it brings the whole thing alive. You're not just looking at it, you're feeling it, you're touching it, you're smelling it. Those are really anyone can do that, and you can do that in 2 minutes, and
Mm.
you will absolutely get the benefits from it.
Great advice. Invoking more of the senses rather than just taking that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Dr. Kathy Willis, thank you for all of this. What a fun conversation.
Oh, it's been lovely to talk to you. Do come visit.
You got it. And be prepared. I will follow up on that.
Absolutely. Anyway,
Okay.
very good to see you. Thank
You
you very
too.
much.
Thanks again. See you later.
Bye.
Bye.
One of the many things I enjoyed about this conversation was that Dr. Willis really brought more of the science to some of the studies that we may have heard about in the past, such as patients that were hospitalized in a room without a view to natural spaces outside. They recovered less quickly than those who had a nature view outside. Fascinating, along with many other examples in our conversation today. If you have any questions or thoughts that you'd like to share, I would love for you to share those in the comment section here. And be sure to scroll down for other relevant information and links that we've added to enhance this episode. And speaking of links, I have announcements for you that you should know that are hyper timely for now. First is the annual holiday gift guide that we update every year ahead of the holiday season. It's a summary of my favorite gardening tools, gear, and gadgets that you might want to know about for yourself or that special gardener in your life. Consider it a one-stop shop for all the things that I use a lot and are definitely worthy of your consideration too. And you can check out the guide from our website at joegardner.com/gift guide, and we'll put the link in the comments below so you can go right there. Also, if you've been following my brand new raised bed rebuild project, that has been going on for over 2 weeks now. And we've had great interest online, mainly Instagram and Facebook. So many questions have come from what we've been doing and sharing. And I wanted to do a YouTube live to answer all of those questions and show pictures of it all and take your questions live as well, if time permits. And this is happening on Tuesday, December 16th at 12 noon Eastern Time here on the YouTube channel. So be on the lookout for that, and we will post information. I think this is going to be a very interesting session. It'll show up on our channel as an upcoming event, so keep an eye on that. And that's going to do it for today. Thanks as always to Amy Prentice, Brendan O'Reilly, and Christine LaFawn for their help on the podcast team. And thank you for joining me today. If you're a regular listener, thank you. I do appreciate that. And if you just found us, welcome, and thanks for being here. For every episode, my goal is to help you take the guesswork out of gardening by teaching you the why-do behind the how-to so that you can become a better, smarter, more confident gardener. I'll be back here again next Thursday for another episode of The Joe Gardener Show, and I look forward to having you right back here to join me for that. Until then, have a great week, take care, and I'll see you back here really soon.